You can hear me? Okay. Alrighty. I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting on today, the Wurundjeri people. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal people in the room today, and I'd also like to acknowledge non-Aboriginal people here who've taken the time to attend this carers dinner. A few quick shout outs to VACA colleagues who I continue to gain cultural inspiration from. Auntie Muriel Bamblett, our CEO, Ivan, DJ, Christine, Shannon, Dion, Kerry Stringer, to my parents, mum and dad, who are here, and also my wife Nellie. My name's Henry Purcell, and I'm a proud Noongar from Kaurna country in South Australia. I'm also born and raised in Melbourne, so I do consider myself to be a proud Koori also. Can I just say straight up that this has been a pretty difficult speech to write, not so much emotionally. I'm strong in identifying with who I am as an Aboriginal man, and also as a 32-year-old who's comfortable with both feet planted in Aboriginal community and what is often referred to as the white man's world. In fact, I cherish and welcome it in some ways because it gives me a unique perspective on what it's like to grow up Aboriginal outside of Aboriginal community. But to articulate my journey, that's been the difficult part. Journey. We talk about a child's journey. When does a journey begin? At what point is a path travelled? I recently became a father for the first time. I'd probably like to say that my son's journey started when my wife showed me the pregnancy pen and tipped her usual glass of red wine that she'd normally enjoy on a Friday night down the sink. Mind you, I kept drinking my glass. What can I say? I needed it. See, some people would say the journey starts 9 months later when he's coming home for the first time. But what about those 9 months building up to this landmark moment? What about building the cot, change table, set of drawers, bassinet, car seat installations, baby clothes, baby shower, more baby clothes, checkup appointments, ultrasounds, gestational diabetes, even more baby clothes, more doctor's appointments, baby classes, baby expos, prams, toys, stuff I'm not sure we even really needed, but you sold me anyway. And to acknowledge Nellie's perspective, Braxton Hicks contractions, discomfort, sleeping on one side, getting the waddle walk on, even more doctor's appointments, fluctuating sugar levels, chicken and veggies on repeat for months, and then of course the induced labour and the pain, and there was pain, but the epidural. Thank God for the epidural. And now our little boy Aiden is here. Cheers. 8 weeks into his little life in the big world, and you'll be happy to know that he's thriving. He's loved, he's adored, he's cuddled, he's talked to, and even though he can't say it, he knows he's in an environment where he's loved, where he belongs, where his culture is respected, and he has given us an even richer environment because he's a part of it now. I myself, I was 9 weeks of age when I was adopted, and it goes something like this. Mum had 4 days to prepare for me. She gets a phone call. On the other end of that phone was a social worker from VACA advising her that they had a little Aboriginal baby who needs a loving home. Mum thought it was her friend Karen playing a joke on her and said, "Ha ha, Karen, very funny," and hung up the phone. Suffice to say, it was not a joke. And 4 days later, I was introduced to my new family, a loving, culturally understanding, and wonderful family. But let's digress for a moment to give you some context. No, I was not given away in some phone scam. Mum and Dad did not just win a raffle giving away Koori babies. I was in fact the result of my natural mother Jo, who at 14 years of age was dating the most popular guy in town, a 19-year-old strapping young lad by the name of Walter, who was a champion boxer. He was popular, he was outgoing, incredibly good at sport. However, when he got on the drink, he turned into a dick. At 14 years of age, Jo fell pregnant with me and she escaped the town she was in to come to Melbourne for the pregnancy, and I suppose you could say that's where my journey started. It was a healthy pregnancy and Jo was supported by the women's refuge she stayed at. She had mature and dignified conviction around her decision to give me up for adoption. This was a weight and a burden not many 14-year-olds would have been able to deal with, But the truth is that Jo had her reasons, and those reasons were meaningful, sincere, and had everything to do with breaking the cycle of transgenerational trauma. Her checklist would have looked something like this. Right, if I give Aiden up, Aiden, by the way, was the name that she gave me. My adoptive parents, mum and dad, named me Henry. If I give Aiden up, it has to have consequences that will improve my chances of a positive life outcome. I'll go straight back to school and finish year 12. I'll move on to tertiary studies and ensure that I make something for myself. I will be empowered as a young Aboriginal woman to become independent and provide security for myself and the family I will have in years to come. And I will make sure Aiden ends up in a family that fosters and nurtures that same cultural empowerment. There's a level of insight and self-awareness there that I can't help but have huge respect for. Despite the outcome being that I was given up, it was for something meaningful, and it was for a better life, not just for me, but for her too. Fast forward 9 months, I was handed over to VACA in Anglicare and placed in a number of foster care arrangements. Now, earlier I mentioned that love that my son has been getting for the first 8 weeks he's been on this earth. Let's just say that I didn't quite receive that same kind of love. Yes, I was cared for, and I was fed, and I was given a cot to sleep in. Let me give you a little more context though. The only piece of video footage that there is of me as a newborn goes for about 7 seconds, and it's of me wailing in some backyard and a foster carer shouting out, "Come on, Harry. There's no need to cry, Harry." I mean, come on. You had 2 names to choose from and you couldn't get either of them. July 25th, 1986, my mum gets the call from the social worker. Mum even kept the notes she jotted down on those initial phone calls. July 29th, I'm home, introduced to my older brother and sister, who by the way are also adopted and have their own unique journeys. Those initial days, weeks and months were challenging for mum and dad. I cried a lot. I had separation anxiety. I didn't receive that bonding that's so important and vital in those early days between a mother and a newborn. And as I settled, that separation anxiety manifested into different behaviours that all pointed to the same cause. And as I've become an adult, the anxiety has further manifested into bouts of depression, abandonment issues, all that fun stuff, which I'm working through, but it's a continuous journey based on learning, maturity, and self-awareness. This was what was called an open adoption at the time. So mum and dad corresponded frequently with Jo, sending photos, letters, offering information as to how I was progressing as a little baby. But ultimately, as I've only recently learned, the correspondence became too much for Jo to deal with, and she asked VACA to cease sending her anything. Jo was at school trying to find herself again after the biggest chapter in her life so far, ostracised by her peers as a teen mum, and it would have been incredibly difficult for her to juggle the commitments of school, being a teenager, and receiving letters about her firstborn that she gave up for adoption. Again, I can't do anything but respect her decision. As carers and as parents, I've never referred to them as carers. Like, this is literally, up until now, I just haven't called them, they're my parents, yeah? Mum and dad did everything right. They kept me, my brother, and sister connected to our Aboriginal heritage. How? They took us to Aboriginal events. They introduced us to key Aboriginal community members like Sir Douglas Nichols. I wore the number 4 on the back of my Essendon Bombers jumper because that was Gavin Wangadine's number. Dad read me Red Chief, arguably the best Aboriginal semi-non-fictional novel out there, as my bedtime story. A book about a young traditional warrior growing up from being the red kangaroo of his tribe to becoming a man and eventually leading his tribe as the Red Chief to victory in a violent war against a rival tribe. This was no, there's a hippopotamus on my roof eating cake stuff. They bought a didgeridoo, boomerang and spear and made sure that those wonderful, tangible Aboriginal tools were visible inside the house, whether it was on top of a bookshelf or otherwise. I proudly took these artifacts to school for show and tell, and I was cool for it. I was really cool for it. I wasn't seen as a token young Aboriginal boy who was unsure of himself, unsure of his identity, and mind you, I was the only Aboriginal kid in my school. My white friends respected me for being Aboriginal, and I proudly showcased my Aboriginality whenever I could, especially on the footy field, which, as you could probably tell now, seems like many, many moons ago. But none of this was accidental. As I've become older, Mum's given me some insight into how much effort and advocacy she went to in order to drive a positive cultural space for me to live and thrive in, and also to protect me. Mum changed schools for my brother and sister due to racism. For me, this time round, Mum made sure she was on that school council at my local primary school, and in one of those initial meetings, made sure that they no longer referred to Aboriginal children as bungs. That's one example of how Mum would preemptively go into environments and situations and stamp out racism, make sure it was a culturally safe space so that I wouldn't have to deal with the racism. Being on the school council and being the mum of an Aboriginal kid also brought a unique level of influence. When Australian history was taught at my primary school, it didn't start with Captain Cook. You need to bear in mind that this was the beginning of the 90s. Paul Keating's Bringing Them Home speech was still a few years off. For a primary school to adjust its curriculum to ensure that Australian history was taught properly, that's hugely progressive for its time. Even in 2018, you'd struggle to find a school teacher who's comfortable acknowledging that Australia wasn't discovered, but in fact is a country with 40,000 years of lived history behind it. But you guys all know that, right? I'm preaching to the choir, I'm sure. Did I mention, by the way, that my mum's white? She's not Aboriginal, and she doesn't need an agenda in advocating and promoting Aboriginal culture as an integral part of emotional health and well-being. She did it because she felt deep and sincerely responsible to do so. And as carers, that's the key message, yeah? Actually, when I advised Mum that I was giving this speech, her key message for you guys, jokingly, was run. The key message is that if you want to care for Aboriginal children, you need to keep them connected. And not just keep them connected, strengthen their community. Strengthen their connections to culture. Make sure they know who they are. Because up until you meet them and they come into your care, a lot of these kids won't even know who they are. In community, we say that being connected to culture is a lifeline for these kids. And it immediately increases the likelihood of positive life outcomes. Look at these photos. I wish I'd put the bloody thing on repeat, but look at these photos that have been rolling in the background and take a second to understand what they represent. They represent family. There's a photo from our wedding of Nellie's family from India, my natural family and my adoptive family together, sharing, celebrating and creating memories together. Photos of Nellie's family and my adoptive family creating memories together. And photos of my natural family and Nellie's family. Within the photo albums that these photos come from, you won't find any discrimination. You'll find understanding, empathy, and opportunities to grow and learn about each other's culture. The most powerful image, in my opinion, is the photo of my adoptive mum and natural mum Jo, seated together at our wedding. Mum insisted that she be seated there. What that represents to me is this. Oh man, fuck, why does this have to happen? Immediately is a sense of selflessness. But what that represents at the heart of what I'm all about and what my family's all about and what VACA as an organisation is all about is self-determination. The strength and power of self-determination cannot be understated. And I promise you that the outcomes in my life wouldn't have been possible unless I'd been empowered to feel strongly in my identity, roots and culture. If my wife, Nellie's mum and dad, hadn't empowered her to feel empowered and strong in her own Indian heritage, as a woman and a one of two daughters in a male-dominated society, her life outcomes could have been different. If my natural family, Jo, particularly hadn't felt strong in her identity and conviction over her decision-making, or my mum and dad weren't strong in who they are as strong advocates for Aboriginal community, then I guarantee you that none of these photos would exist. The key message again is that children and young people need to feel connected with who they are, where they come from, their roots and culture. If you think that as a carer you can ignore that, then yes, run. If you think that as a carer you can shape a child into someone who is disconnected and unsure of who they are inside and out, then you're in the wrong gig. But if you believe that as a carer you can shape a child's life so that they can have memories and cherish photos like these that tell a positive story, then go for it. And VACA will support you in every way possible to ensure that you can do so. Self-determination is about creating your own narrative and choosing the path you want to walk. The guidance offered by carers shapes that child's ability and confidence to be self-determining. My name is Henry. When Jo gave birth to me, she named me Aiden. So Nellie and I, we named our son Aiden. Thanks for listening and letting me share a small part of my story with you this evening. Cheers.